And still, Israel maintains its Gaza siege in its full fury, allowing only barely enough food and fuel to enter to stave off mass famine and disease. Such a policy of collective punishment, as a term that, as organizations, the dozen organizations all said that what's happening in Gaza is collective punishment. He says, such a policy of collective punishment initiated by Israel to punish Gazans for political developments within the Gazan Strip constitutes a continuing flagrant and massive violation of international humanitarian law as laid down in Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. It is long past the time when talk suffices. And this is the part that got a lot of press, and not in the US, unfortunately. At the very least, an urgent effort should be made at the United Nations to implement the agreed norm of, quote, a responsibility to protect a civilian population being collectively punished by policies that amount to a crime against humanity. And I think these two comments, and this was echoed by so many other places as well too. We had journalists, we had organizations, we had international, we had other governments saying the same thing about Gaza. There was later in the slide I showed that soccer player during the Africa Cup who had this thing that sympathized with Gaza. I think when we look at the global outrage over Gaza, it's that there was this consciousness worldwide about how Gaza was an area that was so devastated, that was experiencing collective punishment, Israeli collective punishment, that the Israeli government could have been accountable for, or should have been accountable for war crimes before the violence had escalated, and yet there was very little action to it. And to me, like I said, when I give talks about this, I think it's important just to give the context about really how truly devastating the recent escalation of violence is. Now, the statistics, I know it's really hard to figure out statistics. This is what I got this morning from the BBC and from other places, and I know this isn't new to anybody, but over 1,000 Palestinians killed, half of them civilians. My fear is that, I think that half of them civilians, I would venture that number might even be higher once human rights monitors actually get into Gaza. But for the sake of this presentation, I'll quote what I've been reading. A third of them children, 4,800 wounded. Again, that 4,800 wounded.
A third of a half or a third of
now, as a human rights organization, we have an obligation to apply the same laws to all parties to the conflict, and we have condemned, rocket fire by Palestinian armed groups, including Hamas. We don't just say Hamas because there are other armed groups that have. Rocket fire has killed 3 civilians, as we've mentioned. It's hard to say how many exactly rocket fires have been fired, but around maybe 600 is what our latest numbers say. And in some towns in particular have been particularly affected. This one particular where 40% had to flee, but and that's something that we have as an organization. We have an obligation to condemn that as well. Any attack on civilian is a violation and should be condemned. I think what happens, unfortunately, is there's an effort to create a parity. The idea that Palestinians are killing people, Israelis are killing people, and I simply don't think that construction is fair to the conflict. There's a tremendous assault by the Israeli government, and there is a response, by some who are firing rockets, which is attacking civilians, which we've condemned. But really, the impetus of this issue is the blockade and is the Israeli assault. But nonetheless, as a human rights organization, if there's a civilian who is attacked, then we are obliged to condemn it. Now, in terms of actions by the Israeli government, there are far too many violations than there is time here to go over. But let's just go over a few of them, and then I can sort of elaborate on them. The first is using powerful shells in civilian areas which the army knew would cause large numbers of innocent casualties. One of the terms that we use a lot is that the Israeli response is disproportionate. Now, the question that I get often is, well, what is a proportionate response? So, for example, Israel was attacked by these rockets, and so Israel, legally has a right to respond, but the response has to be proportionate. Well, a proportionate response would be to ensure that all measures are taken to ensure that there's no civilian casualties in these attacks. That's a proportionate response. So, for example, if there's going to be a verifiable, a certain let's say a bomb-making factory, and then these bombs were used to fire at civilians in Israel, that would be a legitimate military target. But what we've seen is that there's been a disproportionate response, so that areas have been attacked that have no military gain whatsoever. An area like, let's say, the Islamic University, like the UN school, or the UN agency that was bombed just yesterday. These constitute disproportionate attacks, which are a very clear violation. So the idea that when we say disproportionate, it doesn't just on the Israeli attacks are disproportionate on two levels. It's disproportionate in terms of the amount of response that we see from the Hamas rocket fire, and it's disproportionate in terms of the number of casualties, but disproportionate actually also refers to the actual nature of the attack itself. The idea that these attacks are done with seemingly little to no military gain, and oftentimes when there is clear evidence that the stated target is a civilian site, an apartment building, for example, a mosque, where there are children, or and I'll get into the issue of war crimes later, which comes to the issue about being deliberate. Blocking off of humanitarian supplies. The Israeli government recently said they were going to allow a 3-hour truce, which to me is just a complete farce and is an insult to the word truce, because 3 hours of a cessation of attacks is just absolutely absurd. When you have a population that before the attacks was so devastated, where the hospitals were running with just a few hours of electricity a day, and to assume that even after the Israeli escalation of attacks, for 3 hours for there to be a sufficient time frame to get in supplies is absolutely ridiculous. And so the UN rightfully condemned it. Amnesty International and every other human rights organization condemned this 3-hour truce and said that there should be an adequate time frame for humanitarian supplies to enter. Now, the Israeli government has permitted some supplies to enter, but it's just to use what Samar said, it's just a drop in the bucket. There's so much more that needs to enter into Gaza, and so we should definitely look through the smoke screen of all that the Israeli government is trying to say, that somehow, well, it's now trying to help supplies get in, etc. The evidence shows otherwise, that there's just simply not enough. So the fact that Israel is continuing to block off supplies, it only furthers the issue of collective punishment, which is something that we've been saying for a long time. Holding Palestinian families as human shields. We published a statement last Thursday saying that Israel was using Palestinians as human shields, which is interesting because, in the Washington Post today, on the cover story, the headline is Debate Grows About Civilians in Gaza Conflict, or something like that. And it's basically saying how now there's this debate, we all know that civilians have been killed, but it's the question of is Hamas really using civilians as human shields? It's a pretty awful article. I invite you to read it, and then if you're so inclined to do so, to respond. I've already written my response this morning. But again, it's that whole narrative that we've heard for such a long time, and it's oftentimes kind of for lack of a better word, it's kind of this racist rhetoric that somehow Palestinians, they don't care about women or children, and somehow they're just so eager to use them as human shields. I think that's just absurd. In 2006, there was evidence of Israel using, and I'm not saying that there haven't been incidents in the past where Palestinians have, used human shields, but there is evidence that is not brought to the table in these discussions in the Washington Post that Israel is also using its Palestinians as human shields. What we found was incidences where, when the ground invasion happened, Israel would go into a home where there would be Palestinians, some of whom were wounded from an attack on that apartment building or home. They would force them to stay in the home, and then they would use that home to then fire, to do sniper fire from those targets. And that is in effect using Palestinians as human shields. We sent out our press release last Thursday. It didn't get picked up, but it's still nonetheless something that should be talked about. That if we're going to talk about human shields, we really have to talk about Israel's use of human shields, which is a very clear violation of international humanitarian law, and it constitutes a war crime. Attacking medical facilities. I mean, this is the one thing that to me has been just truly. So many things are shocking about this conflict, but 19 medical workers within 20 days, so about one a day, killed. Even ambulances that were marked or NGOs that were marked. I mean, Save the Children, there was a good NPR story. A woman was talking about how she raised the Save the Children. They had the Save the Children logo flag, and it was still attacked. And then there's a quote by ICRC that I'll put in here in a second.